Lastly, for this panel, from Councilmember Steve Levin.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to this panel for your testimony. Ms. Johnson, I wanted to ask a few questions. As you know, I represent the neighborhood of Brooklyn Heights and the site of the proposed plan to redevelop that library site. And I wanted to ask a couple of questions pertaining to that issue. The first question is that I wanted to get your take on a piece of legislation that was passed in Albany this summer, and that was signed into law by the governor, allowing the Brooklyn and Queens library systems to be eligible for bond financing, capital financing under the State Dormitory Authority. Was this something that you worked on with the state legislature? And what are your opinions about it? And is it a feasible mechanism with which to raise capital funds?
We did play a role in working with our state legislators on this. We've been, the city is actually, I'm actually a little bit uncomfortable testifying about the mechanism. It doesn't solve all of our issues, and we are, as you can see from a lot of the steps that we've taken over the past year, open to any number of different creative ways to finance. And so I don't think it solves everything, but we thought it would in fact be positive enough that it's something that we should pursue. And we are using funds that come through DASNY to do all sorts of work on the technology front.
Okay, but I mean, would things like, you know, major capital improvements, you know, something like the $5 million or so that's needed for the HVAC upgrades at the Brooklyn Heights branch be eligible for that type of funding? And would it make sense? I mean, what was the thought process going behind doing this, and what is eligible for this? What could be done with this?
It still needs to be paid for. The reason that we went down that path was, in fact, to help fund technology investments. And it would have to be much larger than the legislation that was moved into law.
It would have to be, you mean the cost of a project would have to be?
Yeah, let me first go back to the premise, which is that a new air conditioning system in Brooklyn Heights would solve the problem, and that it's a $5 million investment. And you and I have had many conversations about this issue. A new HVAC system doesn't actually address the needs of that community and doesn't make up for the fact that that library is inefficient and lacks the kind of space that we need to deliver the service that we're in the business of delivering. So that's the first piece. The second piece is that regardless of the technique, you still need a lot more money to do the work than the legislation is going to allow us to raise through the bonds.
Okay, so the bonds are limited in terms of their scope. This is the kind of, I heard about this, you know, through a third party and somewhat recently. So I've never had a conversation with BPL about, you know, kind of what went into this. And I mean, obviously, state legislation passing both houses of the state legislature, signed by the governor. That's a significant measure with a lot of, I mean, it's not just happenstance that happens. So
it was a technique that we used specifically within ION technology, and as you can see from my testimony, I'm not as well versed on it as I should be, perhaps. But it's not a solution to the capital needs that we have across, you know, across the borough. It's not that. Well, let me leave it at that.
Okay. If we could follow up, you know, later on that issue. With regard to the plan put forward for Brooklyn Heights branch, I went there the other day and looked around, just thinking about the type of uses that it gets, and there is currently there's a business branch and a neighborhood branch together, correct? And then there's some additional space that's not publicly accessible. Can you break down those? What's the business branch in terms of square footage? What's the neighborhood branch in terms of square footage? And then what's the non-accessible in terms of square footage?
So actually, I'd put a third. Yeah, the non-accessible square footage breaks down into two parts. There are below-ground storage spaces in that library, which are a repository for documents and material that very few people ever request access to. There is a large percentage of space for staff that's not available to the public, which is just a function of the way library services were delivered in 1962 when that library was designed.
Okay.
And then there's a very wide staircase in the back of that library, which I guess was a design feature, but just takes up an enormous amount of space in that building. And so all told, the space that's available for the business library and for the neighborhood library, public library, is about 26,000 square feet, 28,000 square feet. That, in part, is the business library that is on your left as you walk through the front door. That function of the business and career library is actually moving into the central library, regardless of what happens in Brooklyn Heights. And it's being moved there for two reasons. One, because the services that are delivered in that library are being used by people who live across the borough. It's no longer a place where people who are just doing business in downtown Brooklyn need to go to work. Now that the companies in Brooklyn have internet access and materials at their fingertips in their offices, that space is being used more and more by burgeoning entrepreneurs who live in the center and in the southern parts of the borough. And so it's important to put it in a place where it's accessible by the most number of people who are using it. We've done surveys of people to determine where those folks are coming from. And the other thing is that we built in the Central Library the Information Commons, which houses a lot of very sophisticated technology and has very expensive databases. And the work that's being done there is work that complements what's being done in the Business and Career Library, and so there's some value to bringing those two operations together.
Okay, so for the business branch, just in terms of the square footage breakdown, so the altogether the inaccessible square footage is?
It's like 30,000 square feet.
30,000 square feet. And then the business branch for when you walk in on the left and when you walk in on the right, that together is?
About 32,000 square feet all told.
That's 32,000.
Oh, I'm sorry, because I'm not. I'm sorry. 14,000 square feet. I'm not included the below ground. Yeah.
Okay, the 14 on when you're walking on the first floor on either side.
Yeah.
And then the neighborhood branch, which is the second floor.
All right. Are my numbers wrong? I'm sorry. So the neighborhood library, the branch library in Brooklyn Heights, is approximately 25,000 square feet.
Okay, that's the second floor.
Yeah. That's all told. That's the business library and right. So 15 for the neighborhood.
Okay.
13 for the business library.
Okay, and that's 28. Okay.
Yeah.
So then the proposed branch is what size?
It is about 21,000 square feet.
21. Okay. So there's my concern, just as and this is just kind of on first blush, but my concern with that proposal then is that you're seeing a net reduction of 7,000 square feet of publicly accessible space. To me, whether it's business or branch or neighborhood branch, it's still the neighborhood library. So whether people are...
It means that the material will be different. So it is neighborhood library, but it's also taken up by material, and the material that will be presented in the new library will be more focused on the neighborhood.
Right, but I mean, there could be other uses for, say, that 6,000 or 7,000 square feet, other than like old, outdated like business directories. But like, there's other uses that the neighborhood, the neighborhood's going to basically see a net reduction in publicly accessible square footage, and there's something about that is problematic. That there's whether or not
There's two issues. There's quality and there's quantity. And I don't think anybody, and I can tell you because I even have board members who live in the neighborhood and go into the Brooklyn Heights branch and tell me how woefully inadequate it is. And that's a polite way of putting it. So we will build state-of-the-art space that is beautifully designed, that will provide all the kinds of features that I spoke about in my testimony, flexibility, inspiring spaces, everything that Brooklyn Heights currently does not offer, in a way that we think the very minimal difference between what we're building and what we're giving up will actually end up being a net positive for the community.
Okay, but there's still a decrease in no matter how much better the quality is, there's still a decrease in quantity, and I'm just putting it out there. It's problematic.
Fine.
Now, and then there's also a auditorium space, correct? I mean,
We're counting the auditorium space there will be an auditorium in the new library, as well as there is an auditorium in the existing one, and that space was counted in the total square footage that we just went through.
Okay, and the new auditorium.
There will be a better auditorium.
Okay, so then there's this other issue that I wanted to touch upon, which is that in the proposed plan, there is auditorium space to be purchased or condoed to St. Anne's School, a private school. And that's not the auditorium that you're speaking of?
There will be an auditorium in the library. There will be a condominium that St. Anne's will acquire. And I believe that as my last meeting on this subject, it had not been determined how that space would be used.
Okay. And they're going to pay for that space as if it were a residential condominium?
Yeah, although it won't be as though it were a condominium.
Okay, but it's so because there's a cost to that. There's space that's either, so if you were to look at that space, say it's 10,000 square feet or whatever, that's 10,000 square feet. That's not going to public library space, and it's not going to residential condominium space. It's going to some other third thing, school, not-for-profit school, private school condominium space. But if they're not paying the same rate as a residential condominium per square foot, then the BPL is making less of a return then on that space, and there's no public. I mean, there's really no public.
Well, again, you're presuming
there's really no public benefit to, other than the money coming in, other than like the revenue generated from that sale of that condominium square footage. There's no public benefit to having a private school have auditorium space in this development. I can't straight face say that a private school
there's a premise here.
Public good.
There's a premise here that they're not paying some fair market rate for the space, and I don't know enough to comment on that one way or the other. I do know that that a good part of the space is below ground.
Okay. But then if it has to be weighed, I think, in terms of whether then that would be more appropriate for public library space, publicly accessible library space.
Yeah, this is a part of the transaction that is, but it's not library space. It's part of the development project. It's part of what makes the transaction that work. The library said, this is what we need in order to deliver great library service, and this is what we need to. We need to pull money out of this property in order to invest it elsewhere. We need a core and shell, and you and I have walked through all the elements of the RFP. This is a part of the deal that the library has nothing to do with.
Except that the library chose this.
We had nothing to do with how the space, other than what the library needs, is being fit out.
Right, but if this is, say, 8 to 10,000 square feet, and we're 8 to 10,000 square feet
If the library took more square footage in the building, then we would pull fewer dollars out of the transaction to invest elsewhere, and we would spend more money fitting out the total library. So there's a balancing act that's going
Sure.
on.
Yeah, no, but at the same time, this is the community that is in fact having a new development with all the impacts. I mean, there's a local elementary school that's at 140% capacity, and this is the local zoned elementary school. There's impacts that the local neighborhood has to then bear that that's totally on them. And if they're the ones bearing that burden, then yeah, you'd have to look at what what type where the benefit is. I mean, it's just if a neighbor, I understand why BPL is pursuing this as an option to raise capital funds, but I think it's important to recognize that the local community senses a burden with a development like this. That it's not just it's not free money for that community. BPL raises money, no problem, but it's the community itself that's going to have to then deal with the burdens that are associated with that additional development, and it's significant, and it should be significantly weighed moving forward. That's it.
Yeah, I respect what you're saying. This is, our goal is to build a great library in Brooklyn Heights, a better library than exists today. And while I wish this building could solve every problem in the community, it can't. And we're doing the best to maximize the space and do as much as we can.
Thank you very much.